Greetings, class, and welcome to the sixth lecture presentation for the Philosophy of Religion class. My name is Andrew Bridges. This lecture presentation is entitled Pluralism and Frameworks of Understanding the World Religions. I've prepared a PowerPoint for this presentation, so I will share the screen. Okay, welcome again. The lecture presentation is titled Pluralism and Frameworks for Understanding the World's Religions. And this relates to some of the questions asked back in the fifth lecture about definitions of religions and ways of thinking about religious experience. But now we're going to be thinking about the world's religions in relation to each other. And I wanted to share a few frameworks and show various ways in which those frameworks relate to pluralism. And so the outline is quite simple. So we'll review definitions of pluralism, and then we'll examine frameworks for understanding the world's religions in relation to each other. Some of these frameworks are pluralistic, some are not. But this is, again, we're going to be looking at some of the contrasts here and thinking about these things. And then we'll reflect on aspects of these frameworks and the definitions of pluralism. So pluralism, in the context of the philosophy of religion, has both a philosophical and an ethical aspect. So the first definition of pluralism, and this I took off the website of the Harvard Divinity School's Pluralism Project, I said pluralism is an ethic for living together in a diverse society, not merely tolerance or relativism, but the real encounter of commitments. And so we might ask, how do we perhaps think about pluralism in relation to relativism? And this, again, is when some of the philosophical aspects of this definition come in. And this definition of pluralism I took from the Big Questions text, which you're already familiar with. This is from the glossary. Pluralism philosophically is the view in metaphysics that many distinct substances or ultimate principles exist. And then again, it refers back to ethics. In ethics, it's the acceptance of the coexistence in a society of several different ethical value systems, whether or not they actually contradict one another. This is the fascinating thing, because many of our ethical systems have bases in different world religions teaching about ethics, some but not all. And so when we think about these varieties of world religions and these various ethical claims, and we think about pluralism, we do think about coexistence, but we also think about, is that happening because of a relativistic nature, or is it happening because of some overarching system, what we might call some universal ethical truth? And this, again, might be one place to sort of invite discussion or debate on whether these ethical systems are relativistic to each other, or can they be organized in a different way, which points to some more universal aspect of truth. And this, again, is sort of parallels different ways of thinking about the world's religions in relation to each other. So I thought I'd share 5 different frameworks. I'm going from earliest to most contemporary. So the earliest framework, which is debatably not a pluralistic model, is from Hegel's Lectures on Philosophy of Religion. He did 4 lectures in between the years of 1821 and 1831, and we'll go over that in a moment. Next, about 50 years later, is E.B. Tylor, who was a British anthropologist of religion, his framework in 1871, which basically takes its origin in this concept of animism. Then we have the more popular framework by Huston in his, I think, still #1 best-selling world religions text, The Religions of the World, in 1958, in which he will propose that all religions are, say, different paths up the same mountain to the same mountaintop or goal. More recently, we have Stephen Prothero's framework in his text, God is Not One, in which he says world religions are different ways or paths to different things. And then we have contemporary applications of Anakantabhata. And I chose the article Anakantabhata, Ahimsa, and the Question of Pluralism by Anne Vallely. And this is something that you all were given to read as well, and we'll be discussing this toward the end of the presentation. Okay, so the earlier one is Hegel's Lectures on the Philosophy of the Religion. I chose this one because this was one of the earliest attempts in Europe at the time to start to organize a philosophy of religion which took into account the various religions of the world and various practices of the world. And so Hegel's underlying metaphysic was that the divine, which he used the word Geist, which is roughly translated into spirit or mind, but has aspects of both. So this Geist existed, and it was essentially a divine mind that was active. Some might think of Hegel's philosophy as a panentheism, but this is debatable. And this divine mind manifested itself in human minds through the material reality of history in varying degrees. The other important point to note is the divine mind and the human mind were categorically the same. And so there existed this potential, even a teleos, one might say, or a purpose for the divine mind and the human mind to have the same structure. And the structure was freedom. Hegel uses the phrase that he wants existence and the mind to exist in themselves and for themselves, and to have complete freedom in this sense. The religions of the world, and this is how it is a philosophy of religion, the religions of the world showed differing degrees of this manifestation of their divine, of the divine in their reality. And so this is how he ordered the religions of the world somewhat hierarchically, in the sense that he showed various manifestations of the divine mind present in the material realities of the world. And the philosophy of the religion was to sort of go back in history, both present and past, and to sort of look at this manifestation of divinity in the various world religions. Now, again, he got many things wrong, and this is somewhat problematic for pluralism, is that he ended up saying things like that certain religions had more or less degrees of this divinity and divine mind in them. And he ultimately thought that Christianity had the most, and not even Christianity practice, but a sort of a philosophical interpretation of it. Many scholars have recently argued that he just didn't know enough about the other world religions. And this was definitely the case. He knew quite a bit about Christianity, and he knew quite a bit about the Greek religions. But the other religions which he made statements about, such as ancient Egyptian, Indian religions, Confucianism and Taoism, as well as Zoroastrianism, he knew next to nothing about. And so his view was very limited, and it was much more speculation than in rigorous study. Though for his time, he did do quite a bit of study, and to his credit, he did 4 lectures, one in 1821, one in 1824, one in 1827, and then one again in 1831. And as he read more about these religions of the world, he did change his lectures significantly. So this is a very early type of philosophy of religion. We see the aspects of it where it's encompassing the world's religions, but it's not necessarily pluralistic, because he's saying that there is just one type of substance. But the interesting thing about that is this substance or divine mind can divide itself in ways that it appears as though there's multiple substances. So this is quite a fascinating idea for consideration. Then about 50 years later, 40 to 50, depending on how you measure it, British anthropologist E.B. Tylor argued that religion began as a form of animism. And in many theories of religions, they don't only try to define religion, they try to explain its origin. And this is something that Tylor tried to do. And he thought that all religion began as a form of animism. Animism is belief that there are animating spirits in all aspects of nature, whether it's rivers and trees, animals, humans, in any number of things. He was very influenced by this idea of evolutionism, which isn't evolution, but this idea that progress is made over time in multiple spheres, including religion and mind. And so he thought that religious belief progressed from animism to forms of polytheism, to forms of monotheism. But ultimately, all of these aspects began from this inaccurate explanation in the idea of animism as opposed to science. And he predicted that these religions of the world would ultimately be replaced by science, or just these different religious practices. This is also not an example of pluralism, but it is an example of a philosophy of religion. He takes account of the major religions in the world, and he organizes them in relation to each other. It's not pluralistic because he does just think that one principle of explanation exists, and that's the scientific one. And so we see this as an example of not really pluralistic, right? The scientific truth is the truth. The other truths are inaccurate. And so again, this is a philosophy of religion, but not a good example of pluralism. So we'll proceed next to the next one. Then we have Huston Smith and his idea that religions are different paths up the same mountain to the same mountaintop. This is a quote from Smith. He uses the mountain analogy. This quote is found in Prothero's text, God is not one, but it's a quote from Huston Smith. Smith explains, it is possible to climb life's mountain from any side, but when the top is reached, the trails converge. At the base, in the foothills of theology, ritual, organizational structure, the religions are distinct. Differences in culture, history, geography, and collective temperament all make for diverse starting points. But beyond these differences, the same goal beckons. And so we have this idea that all the different world's religions at the foothills of the mountain, so to speak, there's many differences in doctrines and ethics and symbols and rituals. But as they proceed up the mountain, metaphorically speaking, these differences sort of fall away, and the same truth, the same path, the same idea is there. Now, this is a fascinating idea for pluralism because it is just saying that the same thing is there. So it might be more of a universalism or monism. Just one thing exists at the top of the mountain, as opposed to many different things on many different paths. At the same time, it has a way of being accepting of all the different beliefs, giving them sort of an equal claim to this truth. But again, it's truth singular, perhaps. And this is another thing to sort of ponder about. So what is at the summit? When Prothero is critiquing this view, he kind of brings this view up. Huston Smith, or brings this question up. Huston Smith wasn't the only person that thought this. Many people think this. So popes have said, yes, this is true. At the top of the mountain is God. Mahatma Gandhi also believed that all God is at the cornerstone. Truth, he also said later, was truth is at the cornerstone. The Dalai Lama has this belief that all religions are the same, but it is not God that's at the mountaintop, but rather the good. Prothero takes this quote by Swami Shivananda, sort of explaining this view of Huston Smith, or corresponding to it. The fundamentals or essentials of all religion are the same. There is difference only in the non-essentials. Again, this is somewhat debatable, right? In what is essential, what is non-essential. Ramakrishna had this view of all religions are essentially different paths to the same thing, and his disciple Vivekananda thought this as well. Other individuals like Karl Rahner, who had this idea of anonymous Christians, also had this view. So this view isn't particular to Huston Smith, but Huston Smith, in this best-selling World Religions textbook that's sold millions of copies, is the one that most popularized this view, particularly to this generation and the following generations that he read this text. Prothero argues differently that the world religions are different paths to different things. And in this sense, there's sort of a different focus on the pluralism. There are different things, and there's different paths to these things. But he does have a similar template. In his book, God is Not One, he provides a template for understanding the world religions. How useful is this template? Again, this is one of those debatable questions. So first he says the world religions, they all state a problem, an important problem, as well as a solution to this problem, which serves as the religious goal. And these goals are different per religion. There's a technique, or moving from the problem to the solution, and there's exemplars who chart the path from the problem to the solution. In his text, he gives both the example of Christianity and the example of Buddhism, two world religions, that he fits into this template. So I'll show you in the next slides what he does. So in Christianity, the problem is sin. The solution is salvation. The technique for achieving salvation is some combination of faith and works. And again, he's taking all three branches of Christianity, so about a third of the world's population, and he's condensing it into a template. Exemplars who chart this path. In Catholicism, it's saints, same with Orthodoxy, and it's ordinary exemplary people in Protestantism. So this would be an example of a particular religion with a particular problem and a particular solution, particular techniques, and particular exemplars. And this is quite different from Buddhism, Prothero argues. So in Buddhism, the problem is suffering, the solution is nirvana. The technique to achieve nirvana is the Eightfold Path, which includes practices like meditation and chanting. Exemplars, this depends on the branch of Buddhism, arhats for the Theravadins, bodhisattvas for the Mahayana Buddhists, and lamas for the Vajrayana Buddhists. And so we see different problem, different solution, different techniques, and different exemplars. And this is what Prothero is saying, that world religions are different paths to different things. So this again is a different model. Finally, we have the, and not just finally, these are just some models. There are many more models for understanding the world religions, but I thought that it would be fascinating to end with this model here, the model of contemporary applications of Anakantabhata, which has been used more recently in contemporary scholarship for models of pluralism. So Anakantabhata, Vada just means doctrine. The A is of negation. And so it means non-one-sidedness, or the doctrine of non-one-sidedness, sometimes translated as many-perspectives, many-sidedness, or non-absolutism. It's often told with the story, parable, illustration of 6 blind individuals who encounter an elephant. And they encounter the elephant, they're touching the elephant at different spots as the picture shows, and they're saying it's different things. And so one touches the ear and says it's a fan, the other the tusk and says it's a spear, the other the leg and says it's a tree, and you can see the rest as well. And so they get into an argument or discussion about which one's right. And they all, their sensory experience are telling them that they are, and yet they're having contradictory sensory experiences from the other individuals. And then, according to the story, an omniscient being walks by, an all-knowing being, and this is in the Jain tradition, right? Walks by and explains to them, who is a sighted individual analogously, and explains to each of the blind person that they are in fact touching an elephant, and that what they thought was correct from their point of view, in that it was partially right. But he explains it in its fuller context so they can make even more sense of the phenomena they experience here. And so this is interesting because for many scholars who study Anakantabhata, it provides a understanding of pluralism in the sense that there actually is something, there is an elephant, and it's not just individuals touching things and they're disagreeing on what is. But it also sort of shows the inherent limitation in our human point of view, right? In the story, it's an all-knowing individual that is able to explain the nature of reality. In our human lived experience, we don't have access to this all-knowing individual. And so we have to engage in discussion and dialogue in a pluralistic nature to try to make more sense out of the world. And the article I asked everyone to read for this week is, it's from the text, it's an anthology called Ahimsa, Anekant, and Jainism, edited by Tara Satya. And that particular article you're reading is called Anekanta, Ahimsa, and the Question of Pluralism by Anne Vallely. And I'll pull some quotes out of this article that kind of explain pluralism's understanding with relativism, right? One thing I didn't quite mention is these different perspectives, although anikant can be applied to many different things in perspectives under many domains, it can also be applied to religious dialogue. And so each of these perspectives could be seen as the perspective of a world religion. So this is how it's applying particularly in this case, or how contemporary applications may work. So commenting on Anaconda's compatibility with pluralism, but with an emphasis on the stance against moral relativism, and Vallely in the article Anaconda and the Question of Pluralism, which you all will read this week, explains it has been argued that a truly pluralistic approach is a logical impossibility, that some criteria of truth are essential to all worldviews. Pluralism therefore becomes either a form of moral relativism or another form of religious exclusivism. But she explains that Anakant is a way out of this epistemological quagmire, and that a genuine pluralist view is possible without lapsing into extreme moral relativism or exclusivity, which is the difficulty in all of these frames. It's either one or the other, the two being the former, the third being this interesting compromise very similar to that, and the fourth, or Prothero's, maybe being the relativistic aspect. Anakant has the practical dimension to its embrace of pluralism and rejection of moral relativism. Vallely explains that the aim of pluralism and relativism is to give permission to diversity and difference, to see in others diverse signs of our, quote, divinity, again, in the context of interreligious dialogue. Anaconda goes beyond this. It does not merely give permission to diversity, it ideally mandates an encounter with it. It is only through exposure to other ways of being will a further picture of reality emerge. And here again, we think of the fuller picture of reality being the elephant itself, right? So they're saying, Anakant assumes there is the elephant, that we each have a perspective on it, and that through encounters with others, we can get a fuller picture. So these are some of the contemporary applications of it. In the article, she gives sort of a practical explanation of this, in which she is discussing religious matters with a group of Jain nuns in training. And the Jain nuns are asking her about the religious beliefs she's more familiar with, Christianity in general, and the aspects of the Gospel of John in particular. So this is an example of different religious traditions sort of learning about other religious traditions, asking difficult questions because the worldviews are different, and then people trying to give answers. So this would be an example of Anaconda trying to create a better understanding through pluralism, perhaps. And the questions that the nun in training asks are, she asks two questions. She asks, why in the Gospel of John does Jesus turn water into wine? And from her perspective, holy individuals sort of abstain from things like wine. So why would a holy person do this? And so we can see from a certain perspective, this seems quite a strange thing to do, especially in a text about holiness. And so then the task then is for her, from her Christian perspective, or to explain this to a person in a Dharmic perspective who doesn't actually see the what the spiritual merit in this story is. The second question the nun in training asks is, why did Jesus raise Lazarus from the dead when it's sort of given to everyone? Everyone has to die, and everyone has to lose people close to them. And so again, we see perhaps what we might say is competing, or at least apparently different emphases on points of view, right? In the Dharmic traditions, a certain amount of detachment from such things as this life, so that one can be liberated, is stressed, right? And so the idea that people will die is accepted, right? And so the notion of Jesus bringing Lazarus back to life can be a bit unclear what the merit of that is, given the fact that life is temporary, change is part of life, and that everyone will die. and that we can't be too attached to life in that sense, right? Where if the goal in Christianity is salvation through some aspect of Christ, and Christ is sort of showing divinity through raising Lazarus from the dead, then this is a different viewpoint. And so part of the Anticontroverta within the question of pluralism is very robust interreligious dialogue and exchange, so that other perspectives and views can be more fully understood, so that this picture of the elephant can be clearer. So these are some models for pluralism. At the end of this presentation, I'd just like to maybe provide a contrasting model to this idea of Anticontroverta and the elephant, sort of ask the deeper philosophical question on why, when we're looking at different models of plurality, why is there the assumption of the elephant again? So this might take us back to the idea of relativism. Why do the blind individuals in this analogy assume that they're touching the same thing, as opposed to just assume that they're touching different things? Perhaps the confusion arises not in that they don't have a full perspective, but rather that they assume that what they are coming into contact has to be the same thing. And so a different analogy, just for contrast, might be imagining a group of individuals going into a movie theater and seeing different movies. And then when they come out of their individual movies that they've seen, they can discuss the movies with each other. But when they discuss the movies with each other, they don't assume that they've seen the same movie just in a different way. That would cause argument and confusion. Nor do they assume that the movie they saw is just a part of a larger movie that if they all talk about, they can get some grander understanding. Rather, they just sort of know that they're seeing a particular movie, and that movie might not relate in any way to the other movies. It could, perhaps, but it need not. And so this might be a different way of looking at metaphors for pluralism. Now, I'll say one more thing before I conclude. We all know the success of Marvel movies. And so we might imagine this hypothetical situation in the future. 10 years in the future, a group of people walk into a theater and all the movies in the different theater in the theater complex are Marvel movies because of just the sheer popularity of these movies, right? In this situation, when all the individuals who watch the different Marvel movies come out of the theater and talk about the movies they've watched, they can talk about them in a way that connects all the movies and the ideas together into this larger universe in which all the movies are related. But this again brings up this fascinating point. This doesn't tell us about the nature of movies or about the nature of theaters. It just happens to be that in this particular time and place, those movies all connected to each other. But we can see possibilities in which they can, and we can see possibilities in which they can't, and we can see how both perhaps make sense. I think this will be the even further question for pluralism, right? Is the pluralism understood in this overarching model of unity and just something like in the elephant? Or is it more like the theater in which people just go into different theaters, watch different movies, they come out, they can discuss what they saw, but those movies need not relate. And if they do relate, that may be more coincidence than the nature of the movie itself. So hopefully this presentation provokes some questions about different frameworks of religion, how the ideas in the world religions relate to each other and the various models, plus how this all relates to pluralism. And hopefully you enjoyed the video presentation. Take care.